Picture a plain that stretches from horizon to horizon. No hills, no trees, just grass rippling in the wind like an ocean. Now imagine that grass is alive, that it breathes, thunders with millions of hooves, and raises dust all the way to the sky. Just 200 years ago, the Great Plains of North America were home to 30 to 60 million bison. It was the largest gathering of large mammals the planet had seen since the Ice Age. The herds were so massive that travelers wrote of waiting several days just to let one herd cross a railway line. Then, in less than 20 years, they nearly vanished. From tens of millions down to fewer than 1,000. This isn't just a story about animals. It's a story about how the destruction of one species became a weapon in a war against an entire people. About plains that turned from boundless pasture into a plowed, dusty wasteland. And about a remarkable attempt to fix what once seemed unfixable. Today we'll unpack what really happened to the bison and the plains of the Wild West, and why this story still matters. To understand the scale of the catastrophe, we first need to understand what exactly was lost. The Great Plains stretch from Canada to Texas, from the Rocky Mountains to the Mississippi. Millions of square kilometers of grassland shaped over thousands of years. And at the center of this ecosystem stood the bison. The American bison is no ordinary large cow. An adult bull can weigh up to a ton, reach speeds of 55 kilometers per hour, and, despite looking like a clumsy giant, is a strong jumper and swimmer. But what mattered most was how bison shaped the land itself. As a herd grazed, it didn't just eat grass. It stimulated growth, trampled the soil in a particular way, spread seeds through fur and dung, and carved out depressions known as buffalo wallows, which filled with rainwater and became tiny habitats for other species. Scientists call the bison an ecosystem engineer, an animal that literally builds the environment around itself. Without bison, the prairie gradually stopped being a prairie. Now, about the people. Long before Europeans arrived on the continent, dozens of Plains nations, the Lakota, Cheyenne, Crow, Blackfeet, Comanche, Kiowa, and many others, built their lives around the bison. And that's no exaggeration. The bison gave them almost everything. Meat was the staple food. Hide became clothing, footwear, teepee coverings, and even boats. Bones became tools and children's toys. Sinew became thread and bowstrings. Horn became cups and ornaments. Even dried dung was used as fuel where wood didn't grow. One anthropologist counted over 100 distinct uses for parts of the bison's body across Plains cultures. But it's important to understand, indigenous hunting of bison was sustainable. People took only what a community needed to survive. There were religious ceremonies, rituals of thanksgiving, and strict rules about when and where hunting could take place. The bison wasn't just a resource, it was sacred. The situation began to change with the arrival of the horse, which Europeans brought to the continent in the 16th and 17th centuries. Before that, hunting was done on foot, using wolf hides for camouflage, or through so-called buffalo jumps, where an entire herd was driven off a cliff edge. These were complex, carefully planned operations requiring dozens of participants and deep knowledge of animal behavior. The horse changed everything. It gave Plains nations unprecedented mobility. Hunting became more efficient and safer, and the way of life we now associate with the classic Plains warrior, a rider with a bow chasing a herd of bison at full gallop, actually took shape only a few centuries before the catastrophe that awaited it. Paradoxically, this golden age of Plains horsemen, which now seems to us like a symbol of an ancient, unchanging tradition, was itself the result of relatively recent changes, and historically lasted a very short time before colliding with annihilation. It's also worth grasping the sheer scale of a single herd. 19th century eyewitnesses who crossed the plains left descriptions that sound almost unbelievable today. Colonel Richard Dodge wrote of a herd that moved past him continuously for 5 days. The ground never stopped trembling from the pounding of hooves. Railroad workers described trains forced to stop for hours, sometimes an entire day, waiting for a herd to cross the tracks. One observer compared the rumble of an approaching great herd to distant thunder that never faded. It seemed like this balance could last forever, but a force was approaching that intended to change the rules of the game entirely. In the early 19th century, the westward expansion of the United States accelerated. Railroads cut through the plains, settlers moved in waves, and the bison found itself directly in the path of this advance from several directions at once. The first blow came from the hide trade. In the 1870s, a new industrial tanning technology emerged that allowed bison hide to be turned into tough industrial leather for machine belts, boots, and straps. Suddenly, bison hide became a commodity in enormous demand in the industrial cities of the East and Europe. Hide hunters went out onto the plains in organized crews. A marksman, several skinners, wagon drivers, a cook. One skilled shooter with a large caliber rifle, most often a Sharps, could kill 100 or more bison in a single day, firing at a stationary herd from a distance. The animals didn't flee immediately after each shot because they couldn't tell where the sound was coming from, and kept grazing as each one fell. Hunters called this stand hunting. An entire herd could be killed without the shooter ever moving from one spot. The most famous example of such a hunter was William Cody, better known as Buffalo Bill, who under contract supplied meat to the workers building the Kansas Pacific Railway, and, by his own count, shot over 4,000 bison in under 18 months. He later created a traveling show called Buffalo Bill's Wild West, in which he staged reenacted bison hunts for entertained audiences across the eastern United States and Europe, turning the real destruction of a species into a spectacular legend. The carcasses were stripped for their hides, while the meat, up to 90% of an animal's weight, was most often simply left to rot in the sun on the open plain. Travelers described entire kilometers of prairie littered with carcasses, vultures circling overhead in great flocks, and a stench that carried for kilometers downwind. Railroads dealt the second blow, both literally and figuratively. First, they physically split the enormous herds in two, into northern and southern populations, which destroyed traditional migration routes. Second, railroads gave tourists an unprecedented form of entertainment, shooting bison straight from a train window. Passengers fired at animals for sport without even leaving their carriage, leaving carcasses strewn along the tracks. But perhaps the darkest and most consequential part of this story is that the destruction of the bison very quickly stopped being merely an economic matter. It became a deliberate military strategy. The U.S. Army waged prolonged campaigns against Plains nations resisting the loss of their land. Command quickly realized it was far easier to defeat a people by cutting off their source of food, clothing, and spiritual foundation than to win through direct combat alone. Several senior Army officials openly encouraged the mass slaughter of bison for exactly this purpose. General Philip Sheridan, one of the most influential commanders of the era, publicly opposed any congressional attempt to restrict bison hunting, declaring that hide hunters were doing more to solve the Indian problem than the entire regular army had done in the previous 30 years, and that instead of a ban, they deserved a medal with a dead bison stamped on one side and a starving Indian on the other. This was not incidental cruelty or a side effect. It was a calculated strategy. Destroying the bison meant making resistance physically impossible. Starving communities were forced to relocate to reservations, where they became entirely dependent on government rations, often insufficient in quantity, poor in quality, or simply stolen by corrupt government agents before ever reaching the people they were meant for. The results of this combination of factors, the hide trade, railroads, sport hunting, and a deliberate military strategy, were staggering in their speed. In 1870, the southern bison population still numbered several million. By 1875, it had effectively ceased to exist. The northern population held on a little longer, but it too collapsed to a critical minimum by the mid-1880s. The scale of the slaughter is hard to grasp even today. Historians estimate that of the roughly 30 to 60 million bison that populated the continent at the start of the 19th century, fewer than 1,000 remained in the wild by 1889. In less than 2 decades, the species stood on the brink of complete extinction. Photographs from that era remain among the most shocking images in American history. Mountains of bison skulls, piled up to be ground into fertilizer or industrial carbon, rose higher than rooftops. The prairies were littered with rotting carcasses under the open sky, entire kilometers of plain covered in bones. For the Plains nations, this was not merely an ecological catastrophe. It was genocide carried out by means that bypassed direct violence. The Lakota, Cheyenne, Crow, and dozens of other nations faced an impossible choice: starve on their own land or relocate to reservations, where they became wholly dependent on government food deliveries that were often insufficient, delayed, or spoiled. Historians and anthropologists directly identify the destruction of the bison as one of the key reasons Plains resistance broke down during this period, earlier than it would have from purely military defeat alone. The loss of the bison shattered not just the economy, but the spiritual structure of society. Religious practices and social organization built over centuries around the cycles of the hunt. One Kiowa chief, Satanta, warned government negotiators as early as 1867, long before the final phase of the slaughter, that if the bison disappeared, so would his people, because there was simply no other way to feed children on the plains. Within a few decades, that warning came true almost literally. Testimonies from indigenous contemporaries, recorded in memoirs and oral histories that survive to this day, describe the hungry winters of the 1870s and 80s, when entire communities that had never known scarcity found themselves on the edge of survival simply because the herds they had relied on for generations had vanished from the face of the earth within a few short seasons. A telling account comes from the Crow leader Plenty Coues, who said that realizing the bison would never return struck him harder than any lost battle, because with the herds went the very way of being who he had always been. Alongside this, the land itself was changing. The prairie, shaped over millennia by the grazing of millions of large herbivores, began to transform. Without bison to maintain the soil structure and disperse grass seed, the ecosystem started shifting. Some grass species began to be crowded out by others, and the composition of the soil itself began to change. This coincided with a second wave of change. The federal government actively encouraged settlement of the plains by farmers through laws like the Homestead Act, which granted land to settlers for free on the condition that they cultivate it. Millions of hectares of native prairie began to be plowed under for wheat and corn. The roots of grasses that had held the soil together and retained moisture for centuries were destroyed by the plow. This combination, the disappearance of a species that had sustained the ecosystem, and the large-scale plowing of the natural ground cover, planted a time bomb that would explode only a few decades later. Let's jump ahead to the 1930s. The Great Plains are now a patchwork quilt of farms. Millions of hectares of former prairie have been plowed under for grain crops. Almost no one remembers the millions of bison that once grazed here. Then came the drought. Combined with years of excessive plowing that had destroyed the natural grass cover holding the soil in place, the drought of the mid-1930s turned the Great Plains into one of the worst ecological disasters in North American history. The topsoil, no longer protected by grass roots, simply lifted into the air with the wind. These events became known as the Dust Bowl. Enormous black storms, walls of dust rising several kilometers high, swept across entire states. The most infamous of them, later named Black Sunday, struck on April 14, 1935. Within minutes, a clear day turned to total darkness. Visibility dropped to a few meters, and the temperature plunged suddenly. People caught outside said they couldn't see their own hand held out in front of their face. Dust seeped through the cracks of even the most tightly sealed houses, coating furniture, dishes, and bedding in a layer several centimeters thick every day. Families stuffed wet rags into every gap around windows and doors, but it rarely helped. Thousands of people, mostly children and the elderly, fell ill with what became known as dust pneumonia, a condition in which the lungs literally clogged with fine particles of soil. Hundreds died from it. Livestock died in entire herds as sand filled their stomachs. In Washington, thousands of kilometers from the epicenter, dust from the plains settled on the steps of the Capitol at the very moment Congress was debating a relief bill for struggling farmers. A coincidence that, according to eyewitness accounts, left a stronger impression on lawmakers than any report could have. Hundreds of thousands of farming families lost their land and were forced to migrate west to California in search of any work at all, events that inspired John Steinbeck's novel, The Grapes of Wrath. And here it's worth circling back to the bison. Scientists and ecologists, analyzing the causes of the Dust Bowl decades later, reached an important conclusion. The ecosystem, shaped by millions of years of grazing by large herbivores, was far more resilient to drought than monoculture wheat fields. The roots of prairie grasses reached several meters underground, holding moisture and soil in place even during dry years. By eliminating the bison and replacing the natural prairie with plowed fields, people had stripped away the plains' natural defense right before that defense became critically necessary. In other words, the disaster of the 1930s wasn't simply the result of bad weather. It was the direct consequence of a chain of decisions that began with the destruction of the bison 60 years earlier. Now for the part of this story that's rarely told, how the bison didn't disappear entirely. By the late 1880s, when the wild population numbered in the mere hundreds, a handful of people, for very different reasons, decided that allowing the species to go fully extinct was unacceptable. Among them were naturalist hunters like William Hornaday, who went on to found the New York Zoological Society and actively lobbied for the species' protection. There were also ranchers who kept small private herds for conservation purposes, some of them, notably, led by members of indigenous nations. The famous private Pablo Allard Reserve in Montana, for instance, was founded partly thanks to a member of the Pin d'Oreille Nation who had saved a group of bison calves back in the 1870s. In 1905, the American Bison Society was founded, bringing together zoos, private herd owners, and government agencies in a joint breeding program. Theodore Roosevelt, himself a former bison hunter, became one of the initiative's leading champions as president. A key turning point came in 1907, when the New York Zoological Society sent 15 bison bred at the Bronx Zoo by train to the newly established Wichita Mountains Refuge in Oklahoma, an event contemporaries called the world's first large-scale project to relocate a wild species specifically to restore its population. The process was slow and difficult. The species' genetic diversity had suffered badly from the population bottleneck. Every bison alive today descends from that tiny handful of survivors from the late 19th century. Geneticists trace nearly the entire species back to only a few founding herds. On top of that, from the late 19th century onward, a significant share of surviving animals were crossbred with domestic cattle in hopes of producing a hardier hybrid known as Catalo, meaning that fully purebred bison, with no trace of cattle genes, were even rarer than they appeared. According to modern genetic estimates, only a handful of entirely pure herds remain, making them of particular scientific and conservation value. And yet the program worked. Today, the American bison population numbers roughly 500,000, most of them on private ranches raised for meat, with several tens of thousands living in wild or semi-wild conditions in refuges and national parks, including Yellowstone, home to one of the few populations with an unbroken genetic lineage tracing back to the wild 19th century herds. An especially important part of this story has unfolded in recent decades. Plains nations themselves have led the movement to bring bison back to their lands. The Intertribal Buffalo Council now unites more than 80 tribes across the United States and Canada working to restore their own bison herds on reservation land, not for tourism or profit, but to restore a cultural and spiritual connection severed more than a century ago. For many communities, this isn't just an ecological project. It's a process of healing historical trauma. And what became of the plains themselves? Here the story is more complicated and doesn't have quite so tidy a happy ending. Today, only a small fraction of the original Great Plains prairie remains in an untouched state. Ecologists estimate less than a quarter of the original area, and in some of the most fertile regions, far less than that. The rest has been converted into agricultural land, which remains the backbone of U.S. food production to this day. This creates ongoing tension between ecologists seeking to restore native prairie and the farming sector, for whom this land is a source of livelihood. Prairie restoration projects, including the return of bison to large private and conservation lands, are seen by many as a way to simultaneously restore the ecosystem and strengthen soil resilience against future droughts, especially as the climate grows increasingly unpredictable. Organizations like American Prairie in Montana are working to buy up private ranches and merge them into one enormous, unbroken protected area, essentially an attempt to recreate at least part of the boundless steppe that existed 2 centuries ago. The project's ultimate goal is a territory of over 1 million hectares, larger than some national parks, where bison, wolves, and other prairie species could live with almost no human interference. This is an ambitious, yet very slow and controversial process. Local farming communities often view such initiatives warily, fearing job losses and disruption to a way of life that has sustained entire counties for generations through ranching. At the same time, hybrid models are emerging. Some ranchers are shifting towards so-called regenerative grazing, deliberately mimicking the natural grazing pattern of bison. moving cattle herds in ways designed to replicate the effect wild herds once had on the land. Studies show this approach can partially restore soil fertility and increase drought resilience. An indirect, belated acknowledgement of just how intelligently the natural system that was destroyed in less than a single human lifetime had once been designed. Bison were officially named the national mammal of the United States in 2016, a symbolic recognition of their role in the country's history, granted after decades during which this story was largely kept out of the spotlight. The story of the bison became part of a deeper cultural myth about the Wild West, a myth told for decades through the lens of brave pioneers taming a supposedly empty wilderness. But over the past few decades, historians and indigenous nations themselves have persistently rewritten that narrative, restoring facts that were long suppressed, that this land was never empty, and that the destruction of the bison was a deliberate instrument of policy, not a mere side effect of progress. Today, the bison is returning not only as a biological species, but as a symbol. For many indigenous communities, restoring their own herds is a form of reclaiming sovereignty and cultural continuity, a continuity that outside forces tried to sever more than a century ago. Young people growing up on reservations, participating in ceremonies connected to the bison, are forging a link to traditions that once seemed lost for good. And for ecologists, the plains and the bison have become a practical lesson for the future, proof of just how fragile even the richest, seemingly most resilient ecosystem can be once a single key link is torn out, and how steep a price that loss can exact decades later, once it's no longer obviously connected to its root cause. The story of the bison and the plains isn't simply a tale of animal extinction or ecological disaster. It's a story about how the destruction of nature and the destruction of a people can be part of one and the same process, and about how deeply the fate of the land and the fate of those who live on it are intertwined. The slaughter of tens of millions of animals in under 2 decades was not a tragic accident, but the outcome of deliberate decisions, economic, military, political, and the consequences of those decisions, from the broken resistance of plains nations to the dust storms of the 1930s, continued unfolding for decades after the last shot rang out over an emptied prairie. But this is also a story about how, even after near-total destruction, recovery is possible if there are people willing to work at it for decades on end. From a tiny surviving group of animals in 1889 to 500,000 bison today. From a forgotten tragedy to a symbol officially recognized by the state. The plains will never again be what they were before the hide hunters arrived. But in certain corners of Montana, Oklahoma, or South Dakota, you can still see a herd of bison grazing against an endless horizon. And, for just a moment, feel what this continent was like before everything changed. If you enjoyed this video, subscribe to the channel, hit like, and let us know in the comments which historical topic you'd like us to cover next.